welcome to Healing Solidarity, the conference about reimagining international development. I'm Marianne Clements, initiator of this conference, writer and consultant, and facilitator of the replenishment room. And in this conversation with Wanja, we talk about funding models, specifically about the activist-led and participatory funding models which she's been engaged with for a number of years in her time at UHAI. And we talk about what might need to shift in the philanthropic and funding sector in order to make our work more congruent with our values, more effective on the ground, and more in line with the kind of structural change and justice that we actually want to see in the world. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. I find the ideas and suggestions that Wanja shares important and inspiring, and I hope that you will too. So hi, and I am here today with Wanja Muguongo, and we are going to talk a bit about funding and development funding and all the things that come up with that. But first of all, Wanja, I just wanted to ask you to tell us a bit about who you are, where you are.
So my name is Wanja Muguongo. I am in Nairobi. I am in my office, and and I'm the executive director of UHAI ISHRI. That's participatory, activist-led and managed fund that resources the human rights and social justice struggles for LGBTI and sex worker people in the Eastern African region. In 7 countries is where we work, although we do have quite a bit of Pan-African engagement also. Yeah.
And I know that you so you're resourcing work that's maybe difficult to fund in other ways, and I know that you interact a lot with the sort of wider philanthropic and funding environment for this sort of work and for development work in general. Just wanted to ask you a bit about maybe what you've observed. I know you've been in that place for a while, right? I don't remember exactly how long, but a number of years. What are the things you observe, like the general themes that you observe in funding for this sort of work?
So there are a number of things that I observe, and the interesting thing is it's the kind. Philanthropy is the kind of world in which, in my 9, so I've been in this work for 9, going to 10 years now, and one of the things I see is just how things don't tend to move in terms of thinking. Sometimes it takes a very long time for new ideas to come on board. So consistently, the things that I've found problematic consistently over the number of years that I have worked. And I can almost prophesy that 10 years from now, we have this conversation, we have it with somebody else, those issues will still be there, because I feel philanthropy is a bit of an intractable world of thought. And so some of the things I have observed right from the beginning, actually the reason why UHAI was established was just the sheer disconnect there is between the world where work happens and the world where money comes from.
Right.
And it's because of many reasons that where the work happens is where the need is greatest. And there is always particular reasons that are historic and systemic and structural, that also mean that the world where work happens and the places where the need is also the places where the resources are the least.
Yeah.
And there's history to it. There's I run an African fund. There's a history to why there is problems of human rights for LGBT and sex worker people in Africa. Those reasons are historical, and those reasons are structural. There is also a reason why there is very little in the way of resources, and when I say resources, I mean money. There's very little in the way of money to resource those struggles because of those needs. And the history has to do with colonialism. It has to do with the economic structures that Africa has needed to adjust to because of neocolonialism, also because of just unfair trade arrangement, just because of where Africa is in the world stage is a reason why, one, there are the problems that we have, and two, there is the resource need. So then there is the world of money, which is usually a world, again, I say disconnected. And that's especially for our rights as LGBT and sex worker people. So I'm not talking about other things that are also huge needs in Africa, like education or water or health, right, because there are ways in which money is available in the continent to deal with that, but money is not available to deal with the structural issues of human rights, and therefore money is resourced from elsewhere. And because these worlds are different, as I have described, and they're not just different they're different in terms of the geopolitics, the geographies, but they're also different in terms of the species of human beings that occupies.
Right.
So why OHAI was established was to remove that disconnect, because what that disconnect creates is that the world of money, or the world where money exists, the universe where money exists, is usually the place where agenda would be set. Is usually the place where thinking would happen around what the need is, what the solution is, and therefore how much money needs to go into dealing with that problem.
Yeah.
And that became problematic also for activists, because they would be like, oh, you know what? That's not my problem. You have defined a problem that isn't mine. My problem is actually this one. Or you're thinking about my problem is actually not comprehensive enough. And so the idea of forming a fund that was made up of activists within the Eastern African region was so that we could, as activists, resource for money, bring it home, and then have ourselves as activists then determine where that money goes and what agenda that money goes towards. You would think that 9 years later, after OHAI's establishment, because quite a number of participatory activist-led funds have come up in the field of human rights for LGBTI and sex worker people since then, you would think that that would have changed the conversation for philanthropy towards actually having the communities affected by need determine the resources that goes towards addressing that need. You'd think that would happen. That's still an issue.
Yeah.
I had a very interesting conversation last week with a new body of people that want to support work and want to be involved in global LGBT financing. And one of the things that was the conversation is, as they have thought, they think that litigation is the most important thing so that we are able to overturn all these bad colonial laws. And I'm sitting there thinking, great, that's what you thought from where you sat. However, once those laws were established, they created socio-political, economic landscape that goes beyond those laws. So even if you overturn those laws, you still have queer people being chased out of home. You still have queer people who cannot access jobs. You still have queer people who cannot go to hospital and get dignity. So the problems have been compounded by those laws. And therefore, addressing those issues has to be driven by the people who live in the landscape created by those laws. Because those laws did not act by themselves. They also acted within a cultural setup. They also acted within a religious setup. They're also connected to other things that you can't see from where you sit, but I can see from where I sit. And so that's one of the things that within philanthropy needs to be addressed, that funders must see themselves as being part of a struggle, and their role within that struggle is to finance it, not to think it through or strategize it, not to give it solutions, but to finance it. And then the people who are living that struggle then strategize, think about, and do the work. I think that is still a conversation for me that's a problematic about philanthropy that needs to be addressed over time. And it's not rocket science. It actually makes sense in every other sector except in philanthropy. It needs to make sense. The second thing that is a problematic and has consistently been a problematic and will possibly be consistently be a problematic is another thing that would make sense in no other sector except in philanthropy and philanthropy for civil society, which is about fundraising and spending down, fundraising and spending down, fundraising and spending on projects, fundraising and showing that so a number of things. One, how much the struggle costs and who actually costs it and determines what money works for that, but also how the money moves. So one of the things that I have felt is a really huge problematic around how funding is done for human rights work is, there's so many, but the one I'm talking about right now is that civil society organizations are set up not to think about the future. And the future here, I don't mean 100 years from now. I mean next year. You think about this year. You have a yearly budget.
Yeah.
The problem that you're dealing with is not a problem that reoccurs year by year. It's a problem that is structural, that is historical, that has been there for centuries and will be there for centuries more. But you're only thinking about it per year. So you create a budget around it per year, and you fundraise for that budget per year. And part of showing that you are a good person of integrity and of sound financial management is that you spend the entire budget that year, which means that you can't think about the new things that can come up. You can't think about your problems on a long term, even if those problems are on a long term. So that's something that must change. I'll get into the conversations about funding for projects vis-a-vis core costs, but I'm not there then. I'm right here. I am on long-term funding that actually ensures that civil society organizations can last for as long as we imagine that problem will exist.
Right.
So the reason why I'm saying that philanthropy thinks in ways no other sector thinks, if it was oil mining, we've discovered a vein of oil somewhere. The company will be set up to drill that oil for as long as its geologists have determined that oil will exist under the earth. That's how they set up. So they go to a government and say, hey, please, we've seen this, we can do this, and we make a plan. And that plan is not for 1 year. It's not for each year. It is for a period of time. And what governments will possibly give them are tax concessions for a period of time so that they can then be able to establish themselves, build in the infrastructure, and be able to drill oil. And it's really sad for me as a person who is completely environmentally sound, giving an example about oil. But I'm trying to say that's how the corporate world is set up. That's the way governments are set up too. If they look at illiteracy as a problem, they then look at a solution that looks at the demographic. How many people are illiterate? What does it mean? How many people born today will be illiterate tomorrow? And then they have structures and processes of dealing with that issue over time. Civil society, homophobia, let's deal with it this year, right? So no thinking that civil society organizations need to be set up to deal with the issues they're dealing with over time. So some of the things, and sometimes I sound very revolutionary when I'm saying them, but honestly, 10 years from now, they'll possibly be like, somebody will have written a paper and it will be published by Princeton, and it will make perfect sense about why we should endow civil society organizations. So that people who lead them spend less time fundraising and more time thinking about the solutions, because those solutions are for the long term. So that's another problematic that I'm hoping can be dealt with. The third one is that the one for project versus core costs. The thinking that allows us to even have words like overhead within budgets. And for me, it's very interesting because it differs from place to place. I've had uncomfortable conversations with funders who've questioned the overhead of African organizations and do not question the overhead of Global North organizations, for instance. Yeah. And there's one that I actually had to ask: is the Yale graduate that will be employed by a funder in the Global North different from the Yale graduates that I employ? Because they have the same kind of education, then they have the same kind of thinking about what their brain is worth. But somehow African labor is cheaper. And in fact, I went further in that conversation and said, or maybe we want to go back to the historical truism, where maybe African labor should be free. Yeah? How about that? So,
Right.
so maybe that's what we are more comfortable with. Because, so of course the scale is not the same for African organizations or even global South organizations versus global North, but it's a problem all organizations globally, civil society faces, which is you have to show value for money. And value for money means you shouldn't be paying salaries, you should just be doing work.
Yeah.
It then means that the people doing the work are irrelevant to the equation. They are completely irrelevant. And yet it's human beings that make grants. Grants don't make themselves. Grants don't monitor themselves. Capacity support doesn't get itself done. It's done by human beings. And how we remove the human from the equation of philanthropy really worries me, because it means that we see the people who do this really important work as less than who they are. And I'm in no way advocating for any kind of wastefulness. I am advocating for funders recognizing the true cost of getting work done, but also recognizing extremely humbly that they can never meet the true cost. That even when we make grants, because we make grants and we make small grants. If I was to ask our grantee partners to quantify the amount of time and energy that they put in vis-a-vis the grant that WHI makes to them, honestly, our grant would be insignificant in comparison to what they bring in. And that has to be and when funders see themselves as partners within a process, they're able to recognize what else the other partner is bringing. And it is not always need. It is a lot of brilliance, it's a lot of intelligence, and it's actually the only way work can be done. When you recognize that that's the partner sitting across the table from you, you're likely to make very different decisions about what they are worth. So those for me, I'd say are the three things that worry me about funding, and they're consistently worrying me, and they'll possibly worry me 10 years from now.
Yeah. And when you say they worry you 10 years from now, like I totally agree, and with all of those. And then I think, what would have to happen? What would have to be different for us to sit here 10 years from now and say, oh, actually, what do you think people would need to do? I mean, some of it's obvious, right? We have to start paying for African labor as we, or labor in the global South as we pay for in the global North. To me, that's like, it's kind of like if we don't do that, we're not I guess we're not legitimate, right? In many ways. And I think there's lots of discussions about what that means, of course, but basically we shouldn't have budgets where like people in the global North are paid like 4 times what people in the global South are paid, even though probably the people in the global South are likely to have perhaps even more education and more, and more things that they're trying to pay for in their lives, and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So that stuff should change. But then like what sort of conversations or what sort of like things need to happen? Because I agree that these are pervasive and basically I think there's structural problems in our sector, right, that come from a history of trying to go out and help poor people in a kind of colonial and then post-colonial kind of setting. So like what if we turn it back on the sector, like what are the structural, what are the mechanisms to work with that structural change over time, so that in 10 years, rather than saying these are the same problems, we can say, oh look, something shifted.
Yeah, I think for me, how I think as a human being is I never really look at what somebody is doing, the tasks or the mechanics of what they're doing, but where it's coming from. Like what's the thinking behind the actions?
Right.
I actually think that if philanthropy constructed itself as a partner with social justice and human rights, because that's a field I know. So I'm not speaking about relief, I'm not speaking about development, I'm speaking about the human rights sector.
Sure.
If philanthropy structured itself as a partner and came onto the table from a place of humility, of hey, this is what I bring in the room, what do you bring in the room and how can we work together? I actually think that would resolve a whole load of problems, because then once you see a partner and you do not see a beggar and you do not see an interchangeable number of anyone that could use your money, even if you choose to give the money to them or not. But you actually see the person across the table with you as a partner in accomplishing something that you all want to accomplish from a place of solidarity. Then that changes things. It's easy for you to be able to see that the entities that are doing the social good, that are fighting for human rights, are going to need to be doing that for the decades to come, and are going to need to employ the people who can do that, who have the capacity to do it, and who can stay on and work in the field without burning out. And a lot of burnout, by the way, from my observation, a lot of burnout within the human rights sector does not usually, of course, for some people, for some human rights defenders, it comes from the oppression and the human rights violations and being thrown in jail and being surveilled all the time and being followed. That happens. But also quite a lot of burnout happens because of fundraising, because of trying to prove that what you're doing is important, because of always being seen as if you are just $1 away from stealing from the donor. Like, that's what brings a lot of burnout. And I know that in my experience, that is what is what sometimes I catch my team, even when if I give an example, like last year, I had a problem in my team where we had a finance manager who had to be hospitalized twice for high blood pressure. We had a finance officer who was having anxiety attacks, and it was quite a toll on their health. And it wasn't because we had a homophobic attack on our office. It was because we had a donor that was giving us help, and it had nothing to do with integrity. It had nothing to do with anything. It just had to do with power dynamics. So if philanthropy is able to see itself as a potential bully and then get itself from that place into a place of being a potential partner, I think it would change the dynamics of how we see financing for human rights and social justice work, and it would actually make for much healthier relationships. And again, if I give parallels with the rest of the sectors, like corporate. Mm-hmm. Corporate partners that find themselves in a way in which you're losing your share, you're losing your stock, you're losing your stake, you're losing your investment, they pull away. But for there are sectors in which you're able to pull away from a partnership if you don't feel that it is benefiting you. Civil society, because we are always struggling for funding because of the kinds of partnerships that philanthropy forces upon us, you have very little choice. And that what then happens, it leads to burnout, it leads to less efficient work. Or at the end of the day, if really great work is done, it is at great human expense, and it really shouldn't be. So what would I want to, how would I feel 10 years from now is if those conversations changed. And I'm not saying that from an idealistic place. From being the ED of WUHAI, we have a few funders that are true partners. They are true partners. They come to the table and they say, this is what we can offer. How can we do this together? Where do you think this can go? How do you think my contribution makes the best sense? Those, I can tell you, have had the greatest effect on our work. Yeah. And therefore, I know that that's a possibility. So I'm not speaking from a place of wishful thinking.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then I wanted to ask you a bit more about how you give funding out to the organizations that you then support, because obviously you're a funder, getting funding from one place and distributing it in
another place. So in a lot of ways, because of how we are set up, one of the reasons why I would love for WUHAI to be endowed is so that we can be able to be the funder that I think the movement really needs. The funder that gives long-term support. Right now, we can't make a commitment to a grantee that outlives the commitment we have from funders. So if we've got 1 year funding from a funder, we can only make 6 months funding to a grantee. You get what I mean? Because then there's other 6 months about reporting and auditing and whatever it is, and then time to block. If we've got a 2 year funding from a funder, 1.5 years is what we can commit to a grantee. Imagine if we could give a grant to an institution that is working on legal aid for 10 years. They have they can employ and give contracts that are long for their staff, and they can bring in lawyers that can move from one case to its completion, considering how long cases last in our legal systems that are actually quite broken. I would love to do that. I would love for us to be able to make long-term funds. I would like for us to be able to make grants that are bigger than what I actually call pocket change. Yeah. I know that a $5,000 grant sometimes changes a lot in a field. I know it only changes a lot in a field when an organization is young and starting. Once they've built their constituency, once they've built their area of work, $5,000 doesn't cut it. $5,000 is not the price for social change. It's not the price. It's not the cost for awareness creation or changing how families interact with their queer children. That can't be what we are saying. So I would love for us to be able to make the grants that actually are commensurate to the need. So those are the things that, and so what we do is that even with our constrictions, we try to do that. So we were so proud 2 years ago when we introduced a multi-year grant to our peer grants process that was for $50,000. We were like, whoa, $50,000 for 2 years. That was like as part of our peer grants process. We've then from then been able to make even larger grants that are for 3 years, even 200,000 for 3 years. Oh, that has been such a relief, because that has also been for work we can see. Like some of that was to support clinical provisions of clinical care that are community-led. So a community organization that has a constituency of gay men living with HIV, or of male sex workers living with HIV, or female sex workers living with HIV, and then they are running their own clinic. And because people come within HIV, it's actually clear. People interact with the disease from a place of solidarity. They come to the people who are like themselves. If you want queer people living with HIV to adhere to HIV medication, then it's best if the clinical care is being provided by their own, because their own know that sometimes the hardest thing around adherence is food. ARVs are toxic. They are difficult on the body. So an organization will be able to provide nutrition while it's providing clinical care, while it's following up, while it's doing peer support. And because we want to do that, and we believe that that's the way the pandemic is going to change for our communities, we've been able to give that longer term support. And we are like, yes, of course, we'd want to do it for 10 years, but we are happy with the 3 we are able to do it for now. So for Uhai as a funder, because of the thinking that we have about what philanthropy should look like, we want to be that. And it is important for us to be financially independent to be able to do that. Yeah. Because then the agenda is set by our communities and not by anybody else. Right now, the agenda is triangulated around our communities, the funders we get money from, the governments we work in. So those are some of the things that I think are what I would really want to do. And honestly, I can speak for any activist-led fund, because I am in networks of many. That's what they would want to see, because they know that our communities are the best equipped to make decisions about how this dial is going to move.
Yeah. I'm talking about activist-led funds. I wanted to just ask you briefly about, like, for someone listening that hasn't encountered them or understood how they work, what's the mechanism that you use that's obviously different from the sort of traditional model of grant making and funding? Like, what's that mechanism?
Okay, so I'll speak for the Uhai model, but it's also quite similar with many other activist-led participatory funds like the Umbrella or the International Trans Fund. So the model is basically, for conventional grant making, you'll have a program officer who has a portfolio. Maybe their portfolio is human rights. So they, within their portfolio, use different ways of identifying the grantees that they can work with. And then they form those relationships and they determine the grants to be made. And then they forward those recommendations to either the management or to the trustees of the funding entity.
Yeah.
So for participatory grant making, it's very different. Program officers within participatory funds like ours, like me and my staff, serve a very facilitative role. So what we do is that we avail the money to a community, to a group of activists within the community, who then determine the priorities at the time. So we have a competitive process of grant making. So as a way of getting to hear from the movement about what's important. So that is then taken to this committee, and then they look, like for us, the first day of the review meetings is about looking back at all the proposals that the committee has read and thinking, what is coming up at the top as the priority? What's occurring over and over? What is not occurring? What do we think from what's coming up is important to do? And then that group of people make the determinations about who gets funded, and actually how much money goes to them within the constraints of the funding model. And then we as a staff inform, give additional information, like if they ask, what's your history with this group, or what especially have to do with the groups. What's your history with this group? What do you see as the capacity needs of this group, but not what do we think about the proposal? That is not our decision to make. That's purely for the activist committee. And then our board ratifies those decisions, because we leave them to the peer grants committee to make. So it's a very different way of funding from what conventional funding looks like.
Yeah, and it removes some of that sense of the power being all with the person with the money. Of course, there's always power dynamics in however I guess we give that money, but it removes some of that sense of like someone just coming and going, you do this.
It diffuses it in a lot of ways, and it reduces it in a lot of ways. That was so. And also one of the things it does is that it acts as a really good due diligence mechanism, because I have always said that if your peers don't think you're worth funding, then you're not worth funding, because your peers are the ones. And because it is a large group of people, it's not 2 or 3 activists, a large group of people. And of course, if there's bias implicit in us as human beings, but 13 people bringing their bias onto the table, a lot of it gets cancelled out.
Yeah.
Because it's not one person and it's not 2 people who went to the same schools and live in the same housing estate. So it's different people with different ways of looking at life that bring that onto the table. They also bring a true love for the movement because they are a part of them. And they bring, and I would actually say that there are a number, because this committee of activists, like for Uhai, there are 13. This committee of activists are people who are also involved in their groups, who lead groups, who also have their proposals on the table. There is no guarantee that your proposal will be funded. So you will leave the room, you will not interact with the decision making around your proposal or any other proposal with which you would have a conflict of interest. And you will come back in the room and you won't know until the last day whether or not you are funded. And even when you know, I can still see them trying to calculate how much money goes to who, because at the end of the day, I actually believe, and I don't think I'm idealistic because I have 9 years of experience watching it with my eyes, I believe that activists are actually, on the whole, more committed to the movements than to individual parts of it, even the individual part on which that person sits. Like they're able to see it as a broader struggle. And I would sound like a snake oil salesman saying that if I hadn't seen it myself for 9 years. Like it's something I see all the time. The commitment to this is important work to fund. These are important groups to support because we need them for the next 10 years, or we need them because of this litigation that's happening, or we need them because of this policy advocacy happening. And we'll have our peer grants committee members also telling us as a staff, we think this is the capacity support that you need to give this group. We think that we won't award them the $15,000, but we can award them less, but accompany this grant with this kind of capacity support, and then let us know how it went. That's how our meetings actually happen. And it's so amazing to see that, because it's very different from if I had a staff of Francophone program officer who deals with Rwanda and Burundi and the DRC, and then makes all the decisions about that. Absolutely. I think it would be too much work for one person. It would be too much of a burden. And I actually don't think that one human being has, one, the right to make those kinds of decisions, or even the capacity to do so.
Yeah, there's something about it being shared and people being involved in that process of sharing the decision, I think, that probably also invites individuals more into that sense of like the movement being what's important rather than the thing I'm trying to stick up for. Because I think when we're in those power dynamics of thinking there's this one person making a decision, then we are like, oh, I must defend my
space. Yes,
because what else to do? What else to do in that dynamic? You know? I think it's really my personal feeling is that this kind of work that you and others have been doing with activist funds is something that could kind of inspire, you know, more broadly philanthropy, you know, if people are willing to listen. So that's why I'm really excited to have been talking with you today, because I really feel like there's some learning for other people here, that if they're willing to integrate it and really understand what you're saying and what you're doing, could have an impact, so that we might be sitting here in 10 years saying, oh, actually, you know, things have changed.
Indeed. Indeed. I just remain, it's not been pessimistic, but I remain cautious, because I know a lot of times, even with participatory grant making, that sometimes it is like, oh, it's a magic bullet. No, it takes work, and it takes time, and it takes a lot of effort. And it's not the simple way to go about things. It's actually something that must be thought about very soundly before it's embarked on. But at the end of the day, whatever amount of effort or cost that will go into that process actually is not even, it's incomparable, it's insignificant with the gain that you get. As a movement building fund, our processes of participatory grant making build movement. They actually build community just by grant making. Before you even look at the work that's funded, just the process of it is community building in and of itself. It's capacity building in and of itself. I've seen the folks who've served on our peer grants committee and the effect that has had on their own thinking about work and their own growth. And a lot of the leaders we have in the East African movement now, the leaders of note, were actually started out their work serving on our peer grants committee. So I've seen that happen. So it's not some kind of magic bullet. It's not some kind of pill you take and everything is all right. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes trust. And sometimes the hardest thing within philanthropy is seeding trust and seeding power. But that's what is necessary to actually support participatory-led funds. But like what I know I will see 10 years from now, what I know I am confident I will see is the success of participatory activist-led funds. That I am guaranteed to see.
Yeah.
Thank
you so much, Wanja, for taking time to talk to me today. I'm really inspired by the work you've done, and I hope that it will inspire other people listening. I'm wondering, are there any resources around activist funds and the way that they work that you could direct people to? Maybe I could put them in a link with the notes about this talk.
Yeah, well, definitely. There's actually quite a lot. Like Grantcraft has been writing a number of reports on participatory grant making. Okay. The Alliance magazine has published a number of articles on participatory grant making. The thing that I find really interesting is when I started work at Tuhai 9 years ago, when I was starting out, because there was very little globally about participatory grant, activist-led grant making. I couldn't even get any Google hits. It was really hard to get information. And just a few weeks ago, when I Googled participatory grant making, I got like 49,000 hits on Google.
Okay.
So quite a lot of information that has come up, and most of it has actually come up in the last 5 years. It's a growing field of philanthropic thought. So there are some, like I can send you links to different sources that I have looked at, and also it would be great to just direct people towards Grantcraft as a source of knowledge and collation of knowledge on participatory grant making.
Great, we'll definitely do that. Thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Marianne.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to me, Marianne Clements, in conversation with Wanja Muguongo, and this is the Healing Solidarity Conference. Thank you so much for joining us today to listen to this conversation. If you'd like to spend a bit more time with the ideas, suggestions, and thoughts we discussed in this talk, or in any of the others in the Healing Solidarity Conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of the conference and get access to recordings and ongoing conversations about these themes and ideas. Just click the link below this video to find out more. Thank you.